name is Michael Doyle. I teach here in political science, CIPA, and in the law school. I'm really delighted to welcome a visitor from Brazil, and that's Rafael Mesquita. He's an assistant professor of international relations and political science at the Political Science Department of the Federal University of Pernambuco. He's written extensively, despite a very brief career so far, having recently finished his PhD on networks of diplomacy in North-South relations. And now he's extended to look at a history of the evolution of ideas and legitimacy in the UN system. There are a lot of good conventional histories of these questions. The distinctive contribution that I see that Rafael is beginning to make is finding a way to quantitatively assess the ways in which ideas are developed and changed through particularly the General Assembly. And it's a fascinating project of network analysis, also a degree of bibliometrics attached to it. This method of network analysis that he is talking to us about today has been developed in fields of literature and elsewhere. And so he'll be looking at the UN's most cited resolutions as a way to determine what ideas are current and influential in the system. I think it's a fascinating project. He and his colleagues have looked at 20,000 plus resolutions, which is very, very extensive. And today he'll be focusing predominantly on human rights, peacekeeping, and migration. With no further ado, I'm going to ask you to welcome Rafael to this seminar and encourage you to keep eating as he's speaking. And then afterwards, we'll have a chance to ask him questions, make comments. Rafael, the floor is yours. Welcome to Saltzman.
Thank you, Professor Doyle. Thank you all who could attend, both in person and virtually. Very glad you could make it. And also a very special thank you to the Institute for the effort that they put behind organizing this event. I am truly honored with the opportunity. I'm here to share my research on the history of the UN as told by its most cited resolutions. Before we begin, I understand not everybody might be able to stay until the end of the talk, so you are welcome to help yourself to one of the executive summaries that are printed out there in hard copy in the green, in case we have enough for everybody. In case not, write me and I'll share the digital version. And also, I have the feeling that this PowerPoint presentation might be a little bit low if you're a hands-on person. So I also let a big poster there in the middle in case you want to explore by yourself what is the main takeaway from the study, how important resolutions have made their mark in the evolution of the UN. So assume stations now. Begin. Okay. A little bit, Professor Doyle already introduced me. I am an assistant professor in the city of Recife in Brazil. I'm also associated with the GIGA Institute in Hamburg, and I coordinate a project on multilateralism and global challenge that you can learn more about here in this axis. I want to begin with a motivating example. Suppose that you are researching the UN's role in peace and security. Therefore, we are bound to chronicle the rise of peacekeeping operations. From the books, you'll get that you probably should start in 1956 in the Suez Canal crisis and the creation of the UN emergency force. You're writing now in the 2000s, so you also probably will select as the latest important development the R2P doctrine in 2005 as the end point of our story. Recent memory will tell you that there were also some important reports 2 years prior. And for all the rest in between, this is where you'll do your hard work as a researcher, reading a lot of books, consolidating primary data, so that you can find what are the inflection points in this timeline. One of the primary sources you'll probably want to consult are the resolutions themselves, because of course, everything about peacekeeping operations is documented on these documents. On your way, you'll find out that it's easier said than done, because in the time span of 70 years, the UN has adopted something in the order of 2,300 resolutions mentioning the word peacekeeping. And this scourge of scale played out across a number of other topics of interest, from human rights to nuclear non-proliferation and so on. And this poses a real challenge for doing research about the UN, because on the one hand, you would expect that given that the organization produces so much documentation, if only we were able to mine all of those archives, we would deliver very thorough accounts of a number of topics, since the UN talks about pretty much anything on global norms. But then again, because it's so much of a good thing, we really cannot tackle all of that evidence by hand qualitatively. And because of that, most research and histories of the UN, they have to settle for a conventional approach that's similar to histories about any other entity of interest. And we really haven't been able to leverage the benefit of having so much documentation out there. But in your talk today, I'll argue that this need not be the case, because in the current day and age, at the stage where we are at with computational social sciences, the tools that we have do allow us to take stock of large amounts of data to a scale that was not possible before. And secondly, the reward is worth the effort, because the content of UN resolution is highly informative, not only what's going on in the organization, but on global politics and global norms writ large, depending, of course, on what are your assumptions of what these resolutions mean. So with that in mind, I've been ahead of a project for the past 4 years now, which is mining the UN archives to apply data science approaches to extract information from them, so as to deliver the first data-driven account of the evolution of the UN and its core theme as reviewed by the main output of the organization, resolutions. So for the next 15 minutes, I would like to walk you through first the motivation for this research project, then show you the data, how I have acquired this material, a global overview of what it looks like. Then I'll move on to 3 targeted applications on how this method can be used for migration, peacekeeping, and human rights. These topics were selected more or less based on the audience that we were receiving today, and conclude at some point on the way forward with this research. So to begin, why write another history of the UN? There are many good books out there that provide exactly that. I have no interest in replicating what has been done already with very high quality by other scholars. I will argue, nonetheless, that there is room for improvement with regards to methods and to the data that we use to tell these histories. Most of these works, they share the commonality of the same methodological choice. They are conventional histories, and they are put together in the sense that the scholar amasses primary data, interviews people, secondary literature, and so on, and at a given point sits to concatenate everything in a single narrative summary to the extent of his erudition, literary skill, and the evidence that he or she has at hand. Which is fine, this is how we do history. But it is a methodological choice that has some inherent limitations that I think a quantitative approach can be useful to enrich. First, there is the problem of a processing limit. If you're analyzing the documents by hand, then there is a natural ceiling. There's only so much that you can process. If you are ahead of a large project, and there have been a few large-scale projects on the domain of oral history, for example, we're very happy to have Professor Krause here with us, that's leading one of those. And if you have one of those, then you can bring in more evidence, but because of scale, those also only come so often. And I think that poses a particular challenge for modern UN scholarship. Why is that? Well, the UN is not making our work any easier because they just publish more documents every year. If they publish more documents every year and our capacity for analysis is the same, it follows that a modern UN scholar will have to leave out more stuff than someone that was doing research in the 60s and 70s. And that poses a problem for the representativeness of the data that we use. The second limitation I will highlight is that even if you're doing a qualitative history, there is always some fundamental quantity involved. If you make an assertion such as, this was the moment when human rights became more important than sovereignty, you need to have some working definition for what is important so that you can weigh importance and say that human rights had more of that than sovereignty at point X in time. So there's always some quantification involved, which means that a lot of our storytelling about norms, about global politics, actually hinges on our measurement decisions. And this is something we don't think thoroughly about because I have the impression that we in the social sciences and the humanities, we have more of a lot of concepts than a lot of measurement. And it's fine. It's always refreshing if you redefine how should we think about human rights and then look back at the evidence. But then again, it comes at the expense of accumulation, because then you have a moving target. The thing that we want to track over history is no longer the same if we change the definition. So we need to think more thoroughly about how we measure the salience of concepts. Over 50 years ago, there was an idea of how to proceed with that within information science. That's a methodology where my work takes its inspiration from. Eugene Garfield proposed that to write a history of science, one useful strategy would be, well, given that all major scientific breakthroughs and debates happen through academic publication to journal articles, why don't we just look at the list of references in journal articles and reconstruct this citation chain? Because this paper trail, as it were, will reveal to us which documents which studies influenced which studies, and which papers were highly influential, and so on. This is a demonstration of how he applied that to the discovery of DNA. By reconstructing the citation network, we would be able to see which were the founding studies and which were more influential and affected the later generation of scholars. My intention is to do the same, not for the history of science, but for the history of the UN. The core intuition behind my work is that just as citations between scientific articles have been able to trace the evolution of academic fields, so too the citations between UN resolutions can reveal the history of the UN and the big debates that have played out in international relations. So how am I acquiring the data for this project? For the past 4 years, we've downloaded all of the resolutions adopted by the UN from the principal political organs still in activity. So we are downloading General Assembly, Security Council, and ECOSOC resolutions, plus the outcome documents from global conferences. The data covers 1946 until 2022, and the process consists in downloading the original PDFs and metadata from the UN Digital Library, who have also been very open to collaborating in this project, then converting them to electronic text and applying a manual cleaning for correcting errors. This is presented with a very simple 3-step procedure, but it's extremely laborious, and it would have not been possible without my team of research assistants in Brazil. In case you guys are joining us over Zoom, a big thank you for all the work you've done over the years. So far, we have 22,000 resolutions in our corpus, but we still don't have all of the ECOSOC data yet. But whenever it's in, it's probably going to enhance by 5,000 our count. So one of the big deliverables from my project is, of course, the text of these resolutions. Even very old ones need to be processed into electronic text. But then I'm also looking into citations. As you can see from the image, UN resolutions have different patterns through which they might refer to another resolution. So I've assembled a dictionary containing the variations of different forms by which one document might refer to another, and then applied the dictionary to the corpus. And here's the result. I give you the history of the UN in 2 minutes or less. Now, I hope the clarity is not in the way. I did it right. Is there any chance we can get those, turn on those lights?
Just switch right by the door.
Yeah.
This one.
Yeah.
These ones that are on top of this.
No.
No?
That's the,
That looks that.
Let's say off. We will say off.
Okay, no problem. It might be difficult to visualize at the beginning, but then as the animation progresses, it's easier. So what you have here is the evolving network of resolutions and their citations. The resolutions are individual nodes. The links are the citations between resolutions. The size of the node is proportional to incoming citations. The color is a thematic cluster. And the shape is the organ. So circle for General Assembly, squares for Security Council, triangles for conferences. So this map is a visual representation, and if you have it, of the big debates that have happened over the past 70 years. And of course, because it's 70 years, it's a lot to take in. So we'll look at that again in slow motion for highlight. Thank you. Now, let me draw your attention to an interesting inflection point at the beginning, the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And it's right here, and I hope you can see that it's forming quite a lot more edges or links than anything else because it was very popular at the beginning. In the 60s, we know it's a big inflection point at the UN, decolonization, and we see that reflected in the network. The Declaration of the Granting of Independence is adopted, and by comparing the nodes, we can see that self-determination outpaced human rights as the dominating topic at the UN in the period. Now, there's a lot happening in the 70s, of course, we cannot see everything, but allow me to zoom in on one cluster to show more or less how this network behaves. This here is a cluster on apartheid South Africa. And you can see that it's drawing heavily on the jurisprudence of self-determination. And we see a mix of General Assembly resolutions in the circle, morally condemning South Africa, and Security Council documents actually applying sanctions against Pretoria. As we enter the 80s, self-determination loses steam, it is accomplished, so the topic begins to lose salience, and at the same time, it is the end of the Cold War. So we should expect, at the dawn of globalization, that a host of new themes certainly can be debated at the UN. And the network captures that, and you can see that by the emergence of these new colorful clusters in areas that were previously not lit up in the map. Again, every single corner here is an episode, a debate, we cannot see everything, but allow me to zoom in on one point that the literature talks a lot about, the Security Council in the post-Cold War. So in the 90s, the Security Council began passing resolutions on the protection of civilians. It's this blue cluster there. The topic then evolved into the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And this soon became the most popular thing that the Security Council ever did in its history. And we can get a sense of that by how many citations it received and also by how quickly this cluster proliferated, and also by the distance to human rights we see that it's very human rights focused agenda. So we get a visual sense of what it means in an activist Security Council. The last topic that's worth emphasizing is development. It's an interesting starting point is the UN Millennium Declaration, which, albeit a recent document, grew in popularity at a record rate. It was then a few years later that the World Summit Outcome document came out, the Millennium Development Goals, and then 10 years later, it was superseded by the 2030 Agenda and the modern Sustainable Development Goals, which actually formed their own cluster in yellow. What I find interesting is because the human rights cluster is red, and this modern development cluster is yellow, and the network actually arrays a sort of spatial demonstration of how development and human rights are sort of intermingled in the last 20 years of debates about development at the UN, which is a sort of spatial demonstration of what human development looks like in a network of documents. This is the same information that you get from the poster. Except that the poster, I just focused on the 7 largest clusters, and the colors are not the same. I apologize for that, but you get the same idea of when some resolutions were approved, and by the arrows, you get an idea of how was that material being used in other discussions, such as human rights or the protection of civilian debate in the 2000s. So this might be what you came in here for today, the top 10 most cited resolutions of all time. Without the ECOSOC data, yeah, this is what we have. So the ranking is led by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights first, then the Declaration of the Granting of Independence, the Millennium Declaration, and coming fourth is a finding very dear to my heart, which is a series of resolutions about financial contributions to the UN and scales of assessments. Now, I find this very interesting because chances are, if you are working qualitatively on the UN, you're thinking about the big debates that have transpired in the organization, you are thinking about this great romantic theme of human rights, disarmament, and all of those lofty ideals, which of course they're important, but the budget would certainly not be the first thing in your mind when you think what occupies the mind of the organization. But this is an organization. No organization does anything without money. So it makes perfect sense that actually the budget is one of the liveliest topics that the organization has ever had to grapple with. And I have another demonstration of this later on. Now, I'll be happy to talk more about how I'm going to use this ranking for my book project, which uses those highly cited documents as a gateway to discuss the broader theme behind them. But for today, I only have 3 targeted demonstrations on the topics of migration, human rights, and peacekeeping. So on the topic of migration, how could you use this citation network method with a historical objective? Well, let's begin with the present. This is the state of the art, right, on where the global governance of migration is at, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. From a historic point of view, the relevant question is, how did you get here? If you consult the webpage of the High Commissioner for Refugees, it's a very short story. They will say that before the compact, there was the Marrakesh Convention. Before the Marrakesh Convention, there was the New York Declaration, and that's it. But of course, we should expect it a lengthier story because the UN has been addressing this issue since day one with all the displaced people from World War II. So this is how we could use a network approach to reconstruct the debate on migration. This is where we're at now, the Global Compact. The Global Compact cites around 20 other UN resolutions, and here they are arrayed from oldest to newest. Among these resolutions, we find the official story, Marrakesh and New York, but also some other stuff. The New Urban Agenda, for example, some classic human rights documents, and some more specialized human rights instruments on groups that we can interpret as those particularly vulnerable in the context of displacement and migration, women and children. We can go a step further in the citation network and see what are the resolutions that these 20 documents also cite. Then our network grows a little bit more complex, and we are able to find the distant predecessors of the Global Compact. So we find, for example, the 1951 Conference on the Status of Refugees and Stateless Persons, also Habitat 1, which was a precursor to the New Urban Agenda when the UN began talking about life in cities and the problems that arise therein. Also some modern development documents. And here's also an interesting finding. The Global Compact is one of the few human rights attached debates that touches upon the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. Why is that? Well, migration touches upon the issue of trafficking persons, smuggling migrants, sex trafficking, and so on. So I have the working hypothesis that this specialized debate on fighting crime networks is actually in the UN very tied to human rights considerations on account of things such as the migration debate. Well, in summary, the utility of a citation network like this is to get a glimpse of the normative mixture that is coming together to influence the present regime. We see that there is a combination of core human rights material, more modern development debates with this angle towards life in cities and so on, and also the fight against transnational crime networks. Moving on to another brief illustration on human rights. One of the key findings of the research so far is that human rights are the most important topics at the UN. One of the advantages of citation analysis that is not a fuzzy assessment of how important they are. We can actually measure by, for example, the count of citations. So the Universal Declaration of 48 is the most cited document of all. It has 1,600 incoming citations. And compare that against the baseline. A typical UN resolution will be cited 4 to 5 times in its entire lifespan. Not only that, human rights are the largest cluster. Approximately 1 in every 7 resolutions is somehow about human rights. And then another interesting finding of the research is that human rights have not always been the most important topic. As you saw in the animated network, at a point in time, the Declaration of the Granting of Independence was more popular. And you can see that now in this line chart, as soon as the Declaration granting independence was adopted, it didn't take very long to accumulate more citations than the Universal Declaration. And it remained the most cited resolution in the UN for almost 30 years, until in the 80s, human rights began picking up again. And then just again, to put into perspective, it took over 20 years for the Universal Declaration to reach the mark of 100 citations. The Declaration on the Granting of Independence did that in 6 years. So again, a very firm, crisp assessment of how much more important it became, or how quickly did the agenda shift. I think this sort of data can make a contribution to current debates on the history of international human rights. For those who follow this literature, you know that in the past 10 years or so, it's been split between evolutionary versus breakthrough accounts. One stating that human rights were popular from the foundation of the UN and continue to be so year on year, whereas Samuel Moyn in his last Utopia argued that no, human rights actually were not a global theme in the beginning of the UN, and only in the 70s and suddenly did they break through as an important theme of international politics. And the evidence so far points more in the direction of the breakthrough hypothesis. We can sort of see that only in the 80s did human rights really pick up as the leading topic once again at the UN. To conclude, is there anything interesting we can learn about peacekeeping when we analyze the citation pattern at the UN? And yes, there is, and this is one of the interesting findings of the research. Peacekeeping, I've come to find out, is one of the topics that's dealt with the most jurisprudential rigor at the UN in comparison to other topics. Now, what do I mean by that? Here's a comparison of 2 sample citation patterns, one about human rights and another about PKOs. This is actually the Middle East, but it has a similar pattern to PKOs. What you see is that on a topic such as human rights, modern resolutions, they will cite directly this timeless document, directly. So you end up with a sort of hub and spokes pattern. You need to have the Universal Declaration, that's the hub, and spokes, no matter how far, no matter how late, they are directly connecting to it. When we come to peacekeeping, because also they are discussed intertwined with the budget, something interesting happens. Modern resolutions, they cite foundational documents, the first decisions, but they also tend to cite everything else that was produced as a result of that first decision. So this is an interesting pattern that shows that even though the UN and the UNGA in particular, it's all soft law, they don't really handle jurisprudence or precedent with the same rigor. And my working hypothesis is that, well, they do this when it comes to peacekeeping because it's about the budget. And you have things like decisions laying out who is going to get more for fielding operations, and one would like to faithfully repeat everybody's obligations in that topic. Whereas human rights, they are a more abstract topic. So this might be the driving reason. To test this, I applied a method that I'd be happy to get into more detail about how it works. It's called main path analysis. But the intuition is that you provide the network and you ask the algorithm, what is the citation chain from the beginning until the end of the time period through which most knowledge flow in this network? And the algorithm, even though it's a computer, it doesn't really know anything about the UN. It delivered this string of citations, which actually has high substantive validity because it begins with the first emergency session on the Suez situation. And then a few years later, down the chain, it appears a revolution that realizes that the UN emergency force is costlier than what was expected. And it was beginning to be a problem who was going to pay the bill. And then further down the citation chain, we have the fourth special session of the GA that adopted general principles on cost sharing in missions of heavy expenditures. And then also in the citation chain, we have the actual resolution that decided on the list of who was going to pay more or less for peacekeeping operations. And what's impressive is because this is just from the network. And if you confront this with qualitative histories, a lot of the inflection points that are pointed out and those qualitative works were also captured by the algorithm. Now, I had to be brief. I apologize in case anyone wants to dig deeper into the some of those findings. They have been published in articles at the ISR, Global Governance, and the main piece is coming out, I hope soon, in the Journal of Peace Research. To conclude, I'd like to point some ways forward with this project. Academically, I'm looking forward to connecting with other scholars while I'm here in Colombia as a visiting scholar to receive feedback for the book project. And in case you see anything you like, happy to talk about all the cooperation opportunities. I brought brief examples, but because it is the UN, rest assured that all matter of topics is discussed there. Development, space exploration, what have you. But also I believe that this data has policy utility for actors outside academia, chiefly, of course, for the UN itself, because this is their own institutional history. So I'm also working on initiatives on how to use this analytics in a way that's serviceable to the organization. On some of the threads that I have pursued, chances are you are a diplomat working here in New York or not a data scientist, and hence I'm developing a web app that would allow a point-and-click user interface that diplomats serving here at the UN could use to navigate the same corpus. And one of the agencies of the UN that has been most interested in this project is UNITAR, the UN Institute for Training and Research. And next week we are hosting an event at UN headquarters about using data science to extract insights and analytics from the data generated in multilateral organizations. And that's it on my end. I thank you all for your attention and looking forward to your comments.
Please sit down. Again, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation and a look into what appears to be, from all the evidence you've already presented, a fascinating new tool that we're going to have to interpret the politics of the UN. So I congratulate you on both of those counts. I think it's quite wonderful. I'll start off with just a question and then open it up to any other questions or comments. When you pose your question, please identify it yourself as well, so Rafael will know who's asking you the question. I guess I would start out with one, and a few days ago we chatted about it, and you began to put some interesting ideas on the table, and I'm hoping you might want to share a little further. And that's the question about why the writers of these various resolutions cite previous resolutions. Because as you mentioned, UN resolutions are not binding. They're recommendatory for most issues, the vast majority of issues, with the exception of the budget and a couple others. And second of all, unlike scientific citations, which are both conventionally required in order to publish a piece, if you publish results without documenting who's been there first, you're engaged in scientific malpractice. And no one would charge the writer of a UN resolution with malpractice if they failed to cite some earlier one. So what is the motivation for listing these resolutions that you've been able to work so effectively with? What do you think they're trying to do? I know you haven't done all the surveys on this yet, but what is your estimation of the hypotheses of why they bothered to cite previous resolutions?
Well, thank you for the question. Michael, should we take more in, or can I just?
Whichever you'd like.
yes.
If there are others that are wanted to jump in right now, we would do so. Yes, in the back.
So, my name is Juan, so I'm from the Graduate Center. I wondered in all this map that we've seen and the emergence of some topics, you can see patterns of the non-cycle vibe, you know, that have been explained by the literature. And just like some norms that emerge, then they, you know, they get a tipping point and then die, or they get adopted eventually. So
Thank you.
One more question, and then we'll turn it back to you, Daniel.
Muito obrigado. Many thanks. My name is Daniel Naujoks. I am Director UN Studies Program here at Cited. And this is very close to my own heart and interest. So thank you so much for your work and for sharing your work with us. I've seen in the last couple of years like the more of the corpus analysis of debates and of more debates than the resolutions. So I think you're in addition to like adding to the debates also the resolutions. It's great. I'm not entirely sure what citation history actually tells us. And that also includes, so migration, my own work is migration, so I know the best, and I've been involved in the last 15, 20 years in most of these big events. For example, I was involved in getting migration into the New York Urban Agenda. With Habitat 3, there was a big push. I was at UNDP, we're like doing a lot of things for getting migration in there. That new Urban Agenda is then cited in the Global Compact, right, in 2018, makes sense because there was another movement of getting urban and cities and into the broader migration thing, which earlier was more state level and national level, right? So there was a push of getting this in and then combining it with. But in Habitat 1, which of course is cited in Habitat 3 outcome document, the new urban agenda, is cited, but I'm not sure the idea of having migration in there is at all linked from the Habitat 1 through the Habitat 2 to the Habitat 3, right? So even just because the new urban agenda mentions the previous one, I'm not sure that this migration idea that we see at some point has been there, even though there's a reference to these older ideas about urbanization, right? So the real question is about how can we, if it's just that the document also mentioned this, but we don't know if the migration element of it, by looking at the history of the idea, how the idea has been incorporated, and that would be more interesting to me than just if a document has been cited, right? And what kind of, so what explanatory power does just the referencing have? And how would you supplement it with other kind of analysis to make it a more rigorous case if you want to actually explain things, in addition to having this descriptive, very interesting ideas about the patterns of citation? Sorry for a little long question.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll actually have a slide that will tackle a few of those questions. Now, yes, we did have a discussion on this, Professor Doyle. This work does need a theory of why is it that a diplomat will choose to put a document in his reference list. And my intuition is that it depends on the game that's being played. For some discussions, such as human rights, it might largely be about aspiration and or even legitimation of your agenda. Because the Universal Declaration is so uncontested nowadays that you're almost obligated to cite it if you're doing anything on that topic. So there's almost an overhead that you must reference that, which is networks describe the success breeds success patterns that we see. But for other regimes or topics, then it might be more case specific. As I mentioned, I think when you're talking about monetary contributions, people are a little bit more diligent on amassing everything that was decided on the topic before deciding on something else. But there also might be, for example, the strategy of choosing something as a precedent so that you can move from there to make a case. I would imagine that this might be more of an issue in the Security Council material, because you are deciding, well, how have we acted in the past? We might just point to what's been agreed then, and that will legitimate us to move on with a decision in that field. So there might be some strategy with regards to what is being done. I did, to go deeper into that detail, I explored some of those explanations in the International Studies Review article. There, when I confronted some of the explanations from international law, mostly on our UN General Assembly resolution sources of obligation. And then normally the lawyers will elaborate more on, well, it depends if they are cited a lot, if they impress the importance by showing that this is opinion juris, that the country do believe this is a norm. So there's a little argument there for those who want to dig deeper into this. I recommend reading the ISR article, what are UN General Assembly resolutions for? Now, thank you for your question. I do have one demonstration of the rise and fall of a norm. This is incoming citations with just General Assembly data. And here you have an interesting example, which is the new international economic order, the hallmark for third world economic radicalism in the 70s. And we can really see that pattern through which, when it began, it was extremely popular, but it was a bit of a supernova, as it were. It burned very bright for 15 years. And then when we get to the 80s, it suddenly disappears, completely out of the agenda. And for a reason that scholarship normally tackles, debt crisis, differentiated growth rates between emerging countries and so on. So it's possible to see the rise and fall of topics. Another advantage of networks is that we can actually see that not always lost in a debate. Now this is, I'll take just a second to explain a little bit what's going on in this visualization. This is all the communities, the cluster that were detected in different decades. Okay, so this is all the communities that existed in 1955, all the thematic clusters in 2015. And the little squiggly arrows are the individual resolutions. So the method allows us to see, for example, well, here's the big cluster on the new international economic order. It was very popular, had grown a lot, then shrunk. But we can actually see how some of its material gets transported into a new agenda. And this is the green cluster, which is, again, sorry, the colors are not stable across the presentation. This is where SDGs and modern talk about development are. So we have some things that were on the aggregate of the past norm, and we can actually trace which ones make through. So for example, all of the discussions on population, Cairo and so on, they still have an impact today. But those about sovereignty over national resources, they do not. They stay here and they are frozen in time. And that actually leads me to Danielle's point. I don't have a visual for that one, so I'll just address it. This is, so the core objective of the research is indeed descriptive. I think the main strength of a network approach is describing what's been there, and that's also compatible with the historic research purpose. You just want to tell what has been there using a new metric. When you're describing with the network, you can look at the individual resolution, or you can look at the ensemble, at what a certain group of resolutions mean. So when we look at the pattern, for example, behind habitat, certainly the individual citation could not say that the idea was there in the seed, right, from the beginning, and it came in unaltered to present day. What it can say is that if we reconstruct the citation tree, we will see habitat 1 and all other influences that also combine to make the new urban agenda, for example. So the unit of analysis is not just the resolution and how it was cited. We sort of have to see the whole.
And in order to weigh what was the contribution of habitat, for example, we'll probably put that balance that against all other materials that are coming in to see how is that inspiration appropriated. In the book, I will have more space to sort of do those targeted analysis. For example, in each chapter, when the chapter on development, let's say, I'll have enough time to see what is the overall trend, and then perhaps dig into the individual text of the documents to see in what context were they citing a given reference, for example. But I guess the important boundary for interpreting this is that indeed the direct citation is not the full idea, but you're looking at the ensemble or what's coming together to have a sense of what is the contribution of each source to the future generation of documents.
Thank you. The floor is open. Yes, please. Jean.
Oh, yes, hi. So I'm Jean Krasno, and I've done a lot of years of oral history of the UN on the qualitative side, and I've published Doyle's papers involved me. So my view of listing all the different citations is the institutional memory of the UN is actually very weak. And because ambassadors are changing, staff is changing, the secretariat is changing all the time. And, you know, the unit in political and peace building affairs that covers the Security Council has to keep that history and that memory. And I think that's part of it, you know, for us to, oh yeah, right, I remember that, no, or I should know that. So that's important. I think your study is absolutely beautiful, and I really appreciate it in terms of complementing work that Stephen Schlesinger has done and Michael Doyle has done and so forth, because it gives us another way to look at this. I also want to be clear that while human rights or certain issues might be very popular, that doesn't mean the UN acts on those. You know, and there is pushback from other member states, you know, that really want to protect their sovereignty. So that's another important thing to remember. But thank you so much for doing this. It's beautiful.
My name is Stephen Schlesinger. I wrote a book called Active Creation about San Francisco conference. What I'm curious about is, with all these resolutions, there's no mention of the Dunbarton Oaks or San Francisco in any of these resolutions. Yet, you know, Declaration of University Declaration seems to be more substantive in terms of how people treat the past. But wouldn't the history of the beginning of the UN be part of the pathway towards resolutions?
As a follow-up to Stephen's question, you know, what about citations to the charter itself would be, you know, one way that would tap into the point that Stephen is making. And in the Security Council, it's cited all the time. I think we have a third question to put on. Please identify yourself.
Ferenc also, I'm a visiting professor just on the floor below at the Henry Institute. Thank you so much, really great presentation and fantastic research. I wanted to ask whether there's any way for you to try to incorporate geography. You know, I saw that the 10th is about Israel-Palestine, which really struck me, and I was wondering whether you see some kind of pattern there and whether you could really code that, you know, which parts of the world are really being talked about and how this shifts over time.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you for the question. Thank you very much, Professor Krasno, for the comments. Indeed, I do take that limitation as a comment to the work. Just because a document is popular, you have to make, of course, assumptions about what does it mean if a resolution is cited. Is it actually? It doesn't really mean that it's making an impact out there. So in the work, I will begin by laying out some of these assumptions on what can we reasonably assume that countries are doing or the Secretariat is doing whenever they decide to adopt a resolution or to cite a resolution. So they might be doing things because they actually want to promote policy and enact something, and that might account for a certain share of decisions. I think this might be stronger on some dossiers, such as global commons, for example, because then you really have to decide how to lay out the law of the sea, for example. But for others, they might engage with those practices because it's very symbolic, legitimizing, as is the case of human rights. So this will certainly be a boundary of how far the evidence can travel. Other people might want to complement this research by looking at external indicators to see if things are actually changing. So if you cite the Universal Declaration of Human Rights more, does that correlate with any improvement in physical integrity rights or socioeconomic rights on the ground? So it can be done, poverty alleviation, and so on and so forth. So it might review if there is a words, deeds gap. Now, on the question of the foundation of the UN, I think that, and again, it connects with the point on the charter. How do I think to tackle that? Of course, my book will have its qualitative introduction on how the UN was founded and so forth. I cannot dispense with that, of course. I am thinking about, in the chapters, looking into the ways in which the charter is cited. And I will sort of use that as this more long-lasting link to the original ideas of the organization and how they were, and which aspects were more played out according to the time period. The only challenge is because whereas citations to resolutions are very standardized and easier to detect, citations to the charter they vary a little bit more. So I'm still methodologically trying to come up with how could I automatically pick up all of the references. But whenever I get my head around that, I plan also to apply that to some specific instruments, such as, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 30 articles, and it's also very revealing which articles are more popular over time. I did a trial test, and it seemed like the 5th article is more popular than the rest for some reason. It's remembered more precisely, more often. So this is
Which is on what?
The 5th.
Which is on what?
Got me on that. That's the problem when you're just crunching numbers. And so this is a way that I plan to connect to that. Other approach, and that's been done by people studying debates, for example, is by analyzing the textual similarity. So to what extent do a document today repeats the same language of that was in the minutes and the proceedings of a conference? That could be done, but it's a whole other design architecture, and I'm leaving that. The corpus will be out there, and I'm leaving that to those who might wish to engage with that endeavor. Professor Lapso, the question of geography. Yes, that it's tricky because it goes to the point that Professor Krausner was mentioning on it. There is a filter on what topics will be brought up as a resolution. So the fact that you see some regions being brought up more often, that tells us something about the organization that you have to interpret. Well, it's the life of the organization and how that's and what does that mean. There are already some studies out there who show, for example, how Africa, in particular South Africa, dominated the agenda on the 80s, was one of the most popular topics, and the Middle East presently with Israel-Palestine is a long-lasting topic, and therefore it always draws production from the assembly. So I mean, it could be done on the book. Probably I'll have some more mixed discussion. For example, when talking about self-determination, probably address the geography of South Africa, and on peace operations, the Middle East. Because I think the issue with region is that they come up through the filter of what is it that the organization is paying attention to. And just to conclude, that filter comes to mind when you are also, depending on which body you're considering. When you analyze Security Council output, for example, there will be a big filter there on what gets adopted as a resolution because of the permanent members and what it's on their interest. Which region of the world should we be talking about?
Good, thank you. Yes, why don't we start here? Please go ahead.
So just building on because you mentioned.
Please identify yourself.
Yes, exam, and I am doing a capstone here at Columbia, looking into peacekeeping at the International Peace Institute, so my team is working on some of these issues. Now, I'm also an adjunct assistant professor here teaching politics and sustainability. But in terms of sustainable peace, because you mentioned security council meetings, we got some comments on the geography aspect. I wondered, you have this interesting finding on the budgets. And I wondered if there's a way to really look into the budgets and thinking of the temporary members that get into the Security Council membership. Because they keep changing, so it's quite random. So if there was a way to see if they're being selected, they're being taken in on, has anything does it make it more salient with some of these certain parts of geography, or certain more security rather than aid, right? Certain topics being picked up on the resolutions more so than others, because there is some academic work that looks at this and finds that it is more like a natural experiment, and that there is more money being promoted on aid, and now it's more security going back across and things like this. So I wondered if looking at more of the budgets in the Security Council might be something.
Our colleague here, please.
Yes, so my name is Paul Richards. I've been a science professor on this campus since 1971, although emeritus for the last several years. Some of you, I met Stephen Schlesinger when we were students in Cambridge University in the 1960s, and we meet every 10 years or so in the city. I come into this building perhaps once every 2 years for issues such as the one we heard about today. Thank you very much. But I don't often come here. My point here is I'm a kind of a hardline scientist, but I got involved in policy issues. I was on the team that negotiated the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty for the United States. I had to give up my British citizenship to do that, but I was for the United States in Geneva, and then so that's enough background. So I have a specialized question about the early history of the UN, which amongst other good things was an important forum for international discussion about who would control nuclear weapons. We're talking about 1949. Previous to that, only one country had that technology, and another one picked it up in 1949, of course. And Bernard Baruch made certain statements that didn't go anywhere. But in the many years in which, as I have for the last 40 years, been involved in US government discussion of a comprehensive test ban treaty, which has a finalized text, but is not yet entered into force, for historical reasons, we often hear remarks to the effect that the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, has been on the short list of most referred resolutions from various committees internal to the UN to go to the General Assembly and other forums, and then the Security Council and so on. I don't quite have the right language even to describe the concept, but it's a big deal in the community of those who discuss whether the CTBT will ever move forward, to comment upon its early promotion within the UN forum. Now, you had a lot to cover today, and I was fascinated to hear what you had to say, but that kind of history of nuclear weapons policy did not emerge as a significant role of the UN. There were other things in general to comment. Another one, you referred to citations. Well, you only discuss citations of one part of the UN with another part of the UN. Is that right? I mean, the concept of citations, I mean, you couldn't really do it. I mean, half the newspapers in the world will cite the UN from sometime during the year. So the citations is let me focus, however, on the specialized one. Today, the general public, and I would imagine most of the people going into the UN building don't really know very much about nuclear arms control, because it's not a very popular subject. When did that begin to change in the UN? And can you comment on that latter issue? And then in the early history, was it widely apparent that the UN was a serious international forum for discussion of nuclear arms control?
Hey, thank you very much for this question. I think I also have a visual to help on those. It's on. So the question, your question touches upon one of the again methodological limitations depending on the body that you analyze. I began this project analyzing only the General Assembly, which is actually easier because the membership is stable. Everybody is the same, so there are no important membership changes to account for moving the agenda. And when it happens, it's very noticeable. What is the case in point? Decolonization. From the moment you had a large surge of young nations coming in, the membership changed in the 50s, 60s, and then you saw a whole new agenda gaining momentum in a language and in a focus that was not there before. I don't have the visuals for that, but you do see the changing language that's very interesting from the 50s to the 60s, from administering power to dominator, colonizer, that sort of thing, 1 decade later. In this project, I probably will not be able to account for membership changes within the Security Council because it's everything since 46, so it will be too much to take care of. But maybe within the individual chapters, it will be possible to see, well, there's something interesting happening in this period. Can we see if there was an interesting coalition participating at the Security Council at that point, and then from there proceed more qualitatively with assorted evidence to see if somehow they combine to promote them. A lot of those cases will end up being accounts of normative entrepreneurship. So for example, when time comes to write about women, peace, and security at the Security Council, it will become a story about what Namibia has done and its spearheading of the agenda. So I probably will arrive at those member state level contributions in individual qualitative case studies based on the broader picture. I'll be happy to discuss more on how the development and funding thing evolved, and maybe get a firmer grasp on if there's any more specific movement that I can focus on, and that might be provide an answer. To Paul, the nuclear non-proliferation is actually a very interesting case in terms of negative space in the network. Now let me, it's not here, so I'll just move back to the full network. Okay. Here's the resolution 2373, which is the prohibition on, I forgot the full title now, but it was one of the first landmark documents on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and it became the landmark document on that debate. What do I find interesting is that compare its position, even though it's a very cited, very popular document, compare its position against something like women, peace, and security, or some of those that are closer to the center. Now, the centrality would indicate that a lot of the participants of the network have recourse to that material. What we find, and even if we change the layout, you have this estrangement or eccentricity of nuclear and arms control at the UN. It is a topic that has a founding document. It is a popular document, but all of the discussion is sort of gated because no other important debate has pulled that repertoire to its discussion. So it's a very siloed debate within the UN. Why is that? I think it's a consequence of what was pointed out earlier. What is it that countries are doing within the UN on a certain file, on a certain dossier? This is mostly General Assembly debating countries that do not have the nuclear weapon. So of course, they are morally condemning, trying to elevate the cost of using those devices. But the important discussions are mostly happening bilaterally and so on. So we do have an inflation of the debate here, but it remains very detached from other topics. I'd also be happy to, in case it's interesting, be happy to provide with the actual numbers on how often such instruments were cited, because that would also give an idea of how its salience shifted over the years. But it is very noticeable that among other topics, arms control has this peculiar pattern. It is important, it is referenced, but it's also siloed because no other discussion touches upon this. Whereas if you talk about developments, you also talk about migration to some extent and so on. But this remained very much its own thing.
To just add on to that, also discussion at the first committee, right, which are about disarmament and generally that there's no discussion of the text really in the committee, but it's like from headquarters, from the capitals. That's where, because it's such a dicey issue, right, where all the text, everything comes from the capitals, whereas in the Human Rights Committee, the development committees, right, a lot of the texts are discussed and negotiated by the PRs, by the permanent representatives, by the ambassadors here. So I wonder whether that also makes it, because then the UN has a bigger impact, because the UN is there in the discussions in the room, right, where the disarmament discussions are a lot more really by capital. So I wonder whether that has to do with the less integration in the broader system.
Yes, in the previous paper, I proposed a typology on what is it that how negotiations happen, heavily inspired by what another scholar, Julio, has done on sociology of the UN. And you could see the production of resolutions as either the fruit of debate or dispute. So the debating argument would be that, well, countries might have a position, but they are meeting New York and socializing, and they might, in the course of the negotiation, come to an agreement. So you actually have some topics that might begin with diverging preferences, but the negotiating act brings them together. And scholarship will say some discussions follow that pattern. Development, for example, some people say it was more or less like that. But for armaments, it would be what I would class as a dispute and not a debate case, because then diplomats are not coming to New York to change their viewpoint or find the best answer. They are more like party cadres. They're just representing the party line, as it were, that they are bringing from the capitals, and hence are just adopting resolutions to have showdown, not really to produce an instrument that will guide policy, but to say, well, we have the majority and we're against the minority opinion, and we can pass a resolution saying that we are right and the majority of the world is with us, which again is sort of the tone that you get with a lot of the disarmament debates. So yes, that plays out and might explain why an agenda remains active, remains producing, even though it's not really brought into the core of what everybody agrees with.
Rafael, let me add another question, because it's a very interesting development. One of the ways that you are able to identify the relative salience and legitimacy of some issues is by the numbers of citations. I think that's a very productive strategy. In the past, assessing legitimacy, influence, and salience in the literature on the General Assembly often focused on votes, on the numbers of votes. You know, how large a majority or plurality were attached to various resolutions. And my question is, can you combine those two data sets so that you will have alternative maps of salience and legitimacy? Some resolutions that get overwhelmingly voted for example, would score high on that dimension. And indeed, there might even be counterforces such that a resolution that was overwhelmingly endorsed a few times might be less cited because it had already been incorporated in the whole DNA of the institution. While a resolution that was fought narrowly with a narrow majority, let us say, and it would come back up and up again and be frequently cited, referred to, even though it was, let's put it this way, less popular. And so my question is, do you see a utility in merging the data sets on the voting patterns, who voted and with what majorities, to the resolutions that cite previous resolutions, that your own data set?
Okay, that's an interesting suggestion. I hadn't thought of that, but it can be a very interesting mechanism on why would you choose then not to let go of a document if it was fought hard. I know it's been done in one recent book, 2020, by Guillaume Devin, on the General Assembly, l'Assemblée Générale, an institute, I think it was an Institution Politique Mondiale, and they actually by hand sampled 2,000 General Assembly resolutions, and they tracked, they coded them by hand, what was the topic, and they have 8 or 12 topics, and then they saw which ones were, what was the average of contention, how often were they voted, and which topics were above the average, so more contentious than the average, and which less, and whether that changed over the year. So they did say they came across some interesting findings, such as well, administration, budgetary matters, they're not voted, they are less, and also secretariat, cultural matters, they are bureaucratic, so they're not really voted. And for some, like disarmament, they are always voted, always above the average, and always on the rise. Consensus never improves on that file. And for others, it's a wavy line. So it's been done in the sense of getting the sense of contentiousness across topics, but it could be incorporated within these mechanisms for citation and keeping the debate valid. I've also heard from diplomats that from the moment you cite a past decision, you're actually strengthening the past, as it were. A decision that might have been unpopular at its time or had a narrow margin, if you by and by begin bringing it to the jurisprudence of a certain topic, you might be
retrospective.
Yes,
so to speak.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, indeed. You are sort of strengthening its case, even though at first it was not so contentious.
Interesting.
Rosana de Plano spoke about that 2 years ago. She wrote a book about when General Assembly resolutions become law. And she's a lawyer interested in sociology.
Good. Are there any other questions anyone would care to pose? No? Yes, please.
There's room for one, and Rafael knows that I'm interested about this one particularly, and whether authorship matters in terms of the resolution, and whether procedural knowledge also matters to get it. You know, okay, I'm citing this because, as you mentioned, with some particular topics, they use it to make it, or they use it as a jurisprudence evidence and make it more acceptable. So I wonder if there's variation, and of course, maybe we're not saying that, but in terms of which countries are most capable of getting there, doing that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Unfortunately, this data will not allow to recover authorship. It's just the final adopted resolution. But as you know, I have another project which has the sponsorship of draft resolutions from 2000 to 2020. The article is published on International Studies Quarterly, in case anybody's interested on that as well. And there we can see the country, the draft resolution that it sponsored, and from there you could reconstruct what are the sources that this draft cites, and see then if there is some variation depending on who are the sponsors of the resolution, what are the choices that they make about relevant jurisprudence for a material. It would be a very complex network because it's a network between sponsors, drafted documents and reference documents. So it's very complex to analyze. But yeah, combining both data sets that I have, this one and the one on International Studies Quarterly, one could probably look at that. Who are the sponsors? What was the resolution? And how did that resolution fare? Was it very cited in the future? Did it have an interesting pattern on precedent and so forth?
Are there any other questions? If not, then please join me in thanking Rafael for this fascinating presentation.